Let me just go ahead and share my screen and I'll kick off the presentation. Thanks very much.
Please go ahead. All right.
So perfect. Well, thank you for joining the CXO Summit. And today, I just wanted to run you through human behaviors, habits, cognitive dissonance, and its impact on cybersecurity. My name is Lloyd Evans. I am the identity lead for LastPass by LogMeIn and look after the JPAC region for the LastPass business. If you're not familiar with LastPass, we're the leading password management product globally and within the JPAC region as well. So today, I just wanted to run through a quick agenda. So what is the password problem? Gaps in existing identity frameworks, the password solution, and the foundation of a secure remote workforce. And so I thought I might start by just covering off some recent data breaches, because I think that's a good place to start. Now, these are global data breaches that have happened over the last 6 to 12 months. And so the T-Mobile breach that recently happened, as the CEO had noted, hackers had brute forced their way into their network, which is effectively taking common known credentials or credentials that are exposed on the dark web and brute forcing them away into the network. SolarWinds attack, as the former SolarWinds CEO had said, that the intern that worked for their business had SolarWinds 123 as their password, was one of the reasons why SolarWinds were breached. And although the Colonial Pipeline breach was reported obviously in the press, and you would have seen multiple articles around it relating to it being a ransomware attack, they actually got into the network initially through a weak password on a VPN. So the common thread between these very large data breaches that have happened over the last 6 to 12 months passwords and compromised credentials. And that's a pretty common theme, and I'll show you a little bit more about why we think this is a problem moving forward. So irrespective of any report that you look at, there was a couple of reports that have been produced recently. The Wall Street Journal report, which actually was a reproduction of a Verizon data breach report, which noted that 85% of data breaches globally relate to human error. A lot of that has to do with phishing related issues. So, staff members typing passwords into a bogus website. And a lot of the time this happens because staff know their passwords. If they don't know their passwords, you can't be phished. Closer to home in Australia, there's a report that's produced by the Australian government, the OAC report, consistently without fail over the last 3 years. It is noted that cyber incidents has approximately been 60% have related to credentials, be it through brute force, phishing, or compromised credentials as well. So irrespective of the region, globally, within the APAC region, JPAC region, it's still pretty similar statistics. And as we sort of touched on before, that the Verizon data breach investigation report from this year noted that the human element of this really impacts the way companies are being breached. So despite the fact that companies are investing huge amounts of money in cybersecurity, it really comes down to poor habits and behaviors, and this idea of cognitive dissonance, which is a lot of people know what a strong password is, but they don't actually do it. And so we'll talk through that as part of the presentation today. But some common things that typically just like reusing passwords across multiple systems, using common passwords that are either in the top 10 worst password lists, using weak passwords, and then sharing them, which is pretty common practice, both in a work environment, but also a home environment. If you think about it, a lot of people will probably be using Netflix passwords on their corporate environment, and a lot of companies don't know that's happening. If those passwords have been breached before, then they're exposed on the dark web, and criminals and potentially nation states will have access to that to attack companies. So we've got a saying here at LastPass that hackers aren't hacking in, they're logging in. And what do we mean by that? We basically mean that criminals are taking weak reused passwords and entering in businesses that way. And the statistic that you can see there is actually from Mandiant, the M-Trends report from 2019, similar statistic for this year as well though, but in the APAC region, dwell time is 378 days. And so dwell time is the time that it takes a company to discover that they've been breached. And so it's effectively akin to leaving your front door unlocked, letting someone come into your house and living in your house for over a year and you not knowing that they're there. And that's basically what's happening within our region. And as Mandian had said, mismanaged multi-factor authentication, weak passwords, and a lack of account segregation will certainly lead to a breach, which is pretty evident with the statistics that we showed just before. Another report, this one by IBM. This is a data breach report from this year. As you can see, the top of the list, credentials, compromised credentials, 341 days. So 251 days to identify the breach, and then it takes a further 91 days to contain it. It is the largest component of why companies are being breached today, and it should be a focus for most companies as they're trying to secure customer data, privacy, and controls around it. So what do we see? So we do a report each year. It's called the Psychology of the Password Report. And from our latest report, we found that during COVID and remote working, the people's security habits have been weakened, I suppose, probably to a lesser extent, that a lot of people didn't really change their behavior if they were working in the office or working remotely from home. And 71% of most people will reuse the same password. So we know that this is common practice. This was actually quite a large survey that we did globally, and we looked per region. And the reality is this weakness in security stance has a lot to do with digital fatigue. We're all sitting here on video conferencing tools, presenting this type of information all the time. And so we become lax in terms of the way that we deal with security posture, especially as we're working remotely. And this leads to things like, setting weak passwords for applications and systems and cloud services. It could be reusing passwords across home and work life, and not really thinking too much about it because you're in the comfort of your own home. You're not really in a corporate office, which is probably more regulated in terms of the way that you would manage security. So as we said, 71% of people reuse the same password, and we know that there's about 15 billion credentials that are circulating on the dark web today. And these credentials are effectively used against companies multiple times. We know that from the LinkedIn breach that happened back in 2012, those credentials are still floating around. And if you're reusing the same one, and if you don't have the visibility as a company, this is the other problem. If you don't have visibility around it, how do you protect against it? And so a lot of companies that we talk to and we manage and help deal with this password problem is really to get visibility back in how are staff actually managing credentials, how are they managing passwords, and making sure that they're not reusing them. So we've looked at the data breach statistics, and it's been pretty evident that the fact is that we know that data breaches are happening due to credential loss. We know that some of the largest data breaches have happened due to weak passwords, reused passwords, or brute force credentials. And so let's take a look at why we think this is the case. So a lot of companies have gone through a process of spending a lot of money around identity management and things like single sign-on, multi-factor authentication, and Active Directory. And you would assume by doing this type of activity that we would see a downward trend in data breaches that relate to credentials. But the problem is it actually hasn't happened. All the statistics and all the reports are actually trending the other way. And part of the reason for this is that companies are adopting cloud at such a rapid rate that you get into this situation where there's tail risk. And so what do I mean by that? I mean that as companies adopt more cloud, they don't federate back into AD, they don't federate back into SSO, and they sit outside of the corporate enterprise. Now, these applications, these SaaS applications, shadow IT or shared credentials, are housing customer information. And staff are securing these applications with weak passwords or reused passwords, and they become very easy for criminals, nation states to attack and potentially move laterally through the network. And so despite the fact that companies have invested in SSO and AD and MFA, the reality is the data breaches are still happening due to compromised credentials. And a lot of it has to do with this tail risk that I referred to before. And so where password management comes in is that it effectively acts as an umbrella that sits over the top of all applications. So stuff that sits in SSO, outside of SSO, shadow IT that you potentially can't see, and shared credentials. So shared credentials could be things like finance teams sharing bank account information, payroll teams sharing access to payroll systems, or it could be corporate marketing teams that need to share certain applications like corporate Facebook accounts, Instagram accounts, that type of thing. And so that's pretty common practice for us. And we deal with about 85,000 businesses globally to support them manage credential management more effectively. And maybe just to add to that point, this is actually a report from Okta. So Okta is obviously a large single sign-on provider, but they referenced LastPass as one of the people-centric security tools. And why they do this is because the fact of the matter is that LastPass is both a consumer product but a business product. And we know that the average person has about 191 passwords to remember. And so people-centric security tools like LastPass makes it effective and easy for staff to manage long, complex passwords because that actually reduces a lot of risk for business. So the other thing that I wanted to talk about is that bad passwords happen to good people. And we talk about this quite a lot. CEOs of companies are good people, but a lot of the time, they may have weak passwords. Could be a pet's name, could be a child's name, that sort of thing. And this is pretty common practice across the globe. And as I said at the start, despite the fact that we know that data breaches are happening due to compromised credentials, it really comes down to human behaviors, habits, and what we refer to as cognitive dissonance. And what that is if you stop somebody in the street and you ask them, explain to me what a good password would look like, most people could tell you, okay, it's long, it's complex, it's hard to remember, maybe has special characters, uppercase, lowercase, numbers, that type of thing. But the actual function of being able to do that regularly across all applications is very difficult, mainly because most people have a lot of applications both on their phone for work and personal to manage, and it just becomes almost impossible. That's why we find that a lot of people will reuse passwords, and weak ones at that, because they don't want to forget them. And so the report that we do through the Psychology of Password report by LastPass notes the same thing. 91% of people know that it's a risk to use a variation of the same password, but 66% of people do it anyway. And because of that, we end up with huge data breaches, losing huge amounts of customer information, and putting a lot of people at risk from digital identity theft and all sorts of things. And we've seen that consistently. Now, hopefully there's no Daves on the call, but this is a comic that we like to show pretty regularly. And it really boils down the current state of cybersecurity from my perspective. The fact is that companies will spend huge amounts of money tracking logs, deploying firewalls, SIEMs, these type of information. But at the end of the day, the reason, and the statistics sort of back it up, that human error is the reason why companies are being breached. It's weak passwords, reused passwords, or phishing emails where staff are effectively just typing passwords in to a service and that's being scraped. Now, you can't be phished what you don't know. And so if you use a password manager, you don't know any of your passwords, and password managers will only autofill to known trusted websites. You actually reduce a fair amount of phishing risk. And actually, the Verizon report this year noted that the use of a password management in conjunction with a few other things actually reduced phishing rates by 50%. So 50, quite a significant reduction. What is this? So this is two elements to the slide, but I wanted to talk through this. I actually did a survey on LinkedIn recently in October that looked at, in 10 years from now, do you think you'll have more passwords or less passwords? And compared to 10 years ago, do you think you have more passwords or less passwords? And the reason I wanted to do this is because a couple of things. One is that the password actually turned 60 this year. So consider that. The password's been around for 60 years. And I think part of the reason of its longevity is that despite demographics, despite where you live, most people know what a password is. They know it's effectively a way to secure digital assets. And they're not really going away anywhere, despite the fact that Bill Gates actually called for the death of passwords back in 2004. The reality is that most people still think that in the future they're going to have passwords. And why is that? Part of the reason for that, I think, is that if you look at the App Store today or Google Play Store, there are about 5 million applications to download across work and personal. And every single one of those applications still needs a username and password to sign up to a service and to continue to use that service. And so the development cycle for these applications means that landing pages for login still require username and passwords. And even on my phone, if you use an Android or an iOS phone, yes, you may use fingerprint or facial recognition to sign into your phone as biometrics, but every app on your phone still requires a password. And so despite the talking of, passwordless and moving to this type of technology, personally, I still think it's probably 5 to 10 years away before we get to that state. And as we sort of saw in the statistics, the data breaches are still happening today through credential loss. And so it's really a problem that companies need to solve. And a lot of the work that we do is really trying to help deal with those user behaviors and habits and this cognitive dissonance that we talk about, and really get staff to automate long, complex passwords, store them in a secure vault, and help people manage it more effectively, both at work and at home. And so this will continue indefinitely for a long period of time. And I can't really see it sort of slowing down, despite the fact that a lot of companies are talking about passwordless. I still don't think it's going to be there for quite a while to come. And unfortunately, admin123 is not a real password, although it comes up pretty regularly in the top 10 worst passwords of all time. Again, we really need to think about what sort of passwords are we setting and how are we keeping our services protected. So what is the password solution? So let me just talk through a couple of things around what types of things that we're helping customers achieve with LastPass. It's in 4 main buckets. One is really reducing the credential landscape. So the item that I showed you before with SSO and MFA, there's a gap that exists of cloud applications, shadow IT, and shared credentials. We reduce that gap by using a password management to consolidate it and have unique passwords for every service that you have. LastPass also reduces phishing-related attacks. And as reported on the Verizon report, password managers can actually reduce phishing attacks by 50% or more. Reducing third-party risk is really thinking about onboarding and offboarding. It could be service providers that you have to share access and credentials to, right through to onboarding, offboarding staff for applications that may not necessarily be as part of the corporate. Shadow IT is a good example of this. And the last point is really strengthening regulatory and compliance positioning. So globally, there's been a big shift towards privacy and controls. We've seen that at a consumer level. We've seen that at a regulatory position level, and that's continuing. We're seeing a number of different data protection bills that are coming into effect around Asia. And cybersecurity generally is being talked about at the board level. And so being able to reduce the largest risk that we see, which is credential loss for boards and companies, is a relatively easy thing to do, but it does take a bit of effort to talk through this with staff and to get them to change their behaviors and also the way that they actually deal with credentials today. So let me just talk through the LastPass business at a glance. So this is across the region. So globally, we have about 30 million registered users of the product. We are the #1 leading password manager globally. About 85,000 business customers. There's about 7,000 of those in the JPAC region. We have 3 main support hubs across Sydney, Singapore, and India. We are IRAP assessed by the Australian government, which is a security control. It's similar to FedRAMP in the US, but it is probably the highest security control review that you can get done. I would also probably say it's higher than ISO certification. It's pretty rigorous review by the government, and our product is now approved to use by federal government here in Australia, but also it's applicable across the region. And we have local data storage in three main hubs. And really part of that is our investment to support the region, but also to have data sovereignty in these regional areas as well. And so that concludes my presentation.